After working out the messy details of my previous post series, Microsoft Graph Delta Query from Microsoft Flow, a great friend of mine pointed out that it's probably not a best practice to expose the application secret in plain text in your flow. And I had to agree with him. He's correct. The application secret is the password to that app and an entry point into the Microsoft Graph. To be honest, when I was creating that blog post, I wasn't really thinking so much about the security side of things as I was thinking about actually executing the initial query and the Delta query and getting all of that working. So back to the drawing board, we take a second look at using Microsoft Flow against the graph, but trying to do it in a more secure way. And that's what this video is about. There is an accompanying blog post that goes with it, and I'll show you that in just a sec. But if you'll join me, we're going to launch into creating a Microsoft Flow custom connector, and we're going to use the same use case that we did before, and that is accessing the Microsoft Graph. Now we're going to do this essentially in 3 parts, with a 4th sort of extra added bonus. We're going to create an Azure V2 application registration. We're going to use a preview of a feature of Azure that's coming soon. We're going to use Postman to create a collection. This part is optional, but I think it's a good skill to have in the event you want to use this technique against a different endpoint and you're just trying to learn it against the graph, but you want to eventually apply this skill to something else. The Postman collection approach is a great way to go. And then finally, we'll create the custom flow connector. But in order to actually use the flow connector, you have to create a flow. So we'll create a sample flow, and then we're going to return to our previous post workflow, and we're going to make it much more secure by using this technique. So the first step is to create an Azure V2 application registration. So as I said before, this video accompanies a blog post called Create a Custom Flow Connector for Microsoft Graph. This video will essentially walk through all of these steps, and then we'll add a little bit more to the end because this particular blog post builds on the blog series called Microsoft Graph Delta Query from Microsoft Flow. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details of the Delta query because I already did that in previous videos. So follow me through on this post, and if you have any questions or if I make references to the other posts, that's what I'm talking about. So how do we create a V2 app? The first thing we do is we go into Administration for Office 365, and we're going to go into Azure AD administration. So you can get there through portal.azure.com, but if you're unfamiliar with working through to Azure AD, then inside of Office 365, you can choose the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and you'll be redirected there. Once you're in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, I have pinned app registrations here, but simply go up to all services in case you don't see it and type in app, and you should see app registrations. It's not enterprise applications, it's app registrations. Choose app registrations, and for now, my app registrations offers a preview experience. Eventually, this will become the default experience, so if you're not seeing this, then it may have gone GA. And if you ever need to get back to the original experience, there's a link here in the top to take you back. So we're going to create a new registration. So I click New Registration, and now I'm going to give my app a name. And this is a name that I will see, but it's also a name that anyone consenting to the app will see as well. So you want to make sure that it is fairly understandable when you're doing this. Now, the account type is going to be the kind of account that can access this app. So I'm going to leave it at the most secure, which is accounts in this organizational directory only. But you may want to have other Office 365 accounts or other Office 365 accounts and MSAs. That's up to you. Since we're using this to access our corporate information in the graph, I'm going to leave it at accounts in your organization. We'll click register. And then I get taken to this new, or is currently in preview, view of my app. And what Microsoft has done here is made it a lot easier for me to get the immediate information that I need about my app. So here's the application ID. I'm going to need that later. Here's my tenant ID. Before, we had to go all the way back out to Azure Active Directory to get this, but now it's present right here in my app. I need to call the Graph API from this app. So here's the call APIs, and I can choose View API Permission. And I'm going to add the permission to the graph. So I choose Microsoft Graph. It's nice and big and right here at the top. And I'm going to choose Application Permissions. The first one I'm going to ask for is Group Read All. I type in Group, and then down here, I'm going to choose Read All. So now I have one additional permission. The next one is User, because I want to get user information. So I'm going to type in User, and then down here, I just need User Read All. So now I have the two permissions selected. I'm going to choose Add Permissions. And it says Group Read All, User Read All. You'll notice that it has not been granted permission. And it gives me this warning at the top that I have to consent to make sure that these permissions are applied. Again, previously we had to go to a funky URL to make this happen. Well, now I can choose Grant Admin Consent for Contoso and choose Yes, and that's all there is to it to grant the consent. So that's pretty sweet. The next thing I need to do is create an application secret. Done this a ton of times. I'm going to do it again. Certificates and secrets. New client secret. Give the secret a name. We're going to call this one, because that's where we're using it. The idea behind a name for a client secret is so that you have some idea of where it's being used, so that if you ever have to come in and delete it, you know what's going to break. So here's my secret. I'm going to copy this to the clipboard, and I'm going to save it into Notepad. Eventually, when I navigate away from this client secrets, that's going to be masked and hidden, and you won't be able to see it anymore. So you have to save it somewhere safe, treat it like a password, and be careful with it. I want to point out a couple more things that are nice on this page because we're going to need them later. I mentioned that we need the directory and the application ID. There's also this endpoints page, which is going to give us our v2 auth and v2 token endpoints. If you're using version 1 OAuth endpoints, then those are right here. And then there's OpenID and other endpoints for you if you're using different applications to authenticate. In our case, we're going to be using OAuth, and we'll use those endpoints. All right, so we've created our Azure v2 application registration. The next thing we need to do is create a Postman collection. So previously I mentioned that this Postman section is optional, and I believe it is if you're doing simple requests with the Flow Connector Builder. The testing capability within the Flow Connector Builder is not great, so I find it's a lot easier to use Postman to do that. So this is the Postman app if you haven't seen it before, and I'm going to create a new collection. Inside the collection, it's really just a group of requests. But the thing that's nice about a collection is that you can specify authorization in one place, and then that will apply to all of the requests inside the collection. So we're going to do this as a first step. For authentication, I'm going to choose OAuth 2.0. Then here, I'm going to choose Get New Auth Token, and it's going to ask me to complete the information in order to get the auth token. So the token name doesn't really matter. We're going to leave the grant type as authorization code. And now I have to complete some URLs. The first one is the callback URL. This is the URL that's going to be used to return the authentication information for your app. We're going to use the Postman URL for this. What this means is that I have to go back to Azure Active Directory, to my app, and add a redirect URI to it. So click on redirect URI, leave the type as web, and paste in app.getpostman.com OAuth 2 callback. Once you've done that, choose Save, and then return to Postman. The auth URL, well, that's going to come from our app. So if I go back to Overview and I go to Endpoints, here's my authorization endpoint for V2. Access token, it's right here. Client ID, that's our application ID. Client secret, that's the secret that we copied earlier. Scope. Now, for this demo, we're requesting user permissions and group read permissions. So for that, I'm going to use the auth scopes of graph.microsoft.com, group.readAll and user.readAll. Leave the state the way it is and leave send as basic auth header. Choose request token. You should be prompted for your account. And then notice that it has the app name, flow to Microsoft Graph Video Connector Video, and then the two permissions that we requested. And I'm going to consent on behalf of my org and choose accept. And now I have my auth token. So we've managed to get the authorization working. And I can create my collection. Now we have to make some requests. When I'm working with anything related to authentication with Microsoft properties, I always like to start with a simple request. And this one is going to be the V1 me request. Paste that in, and then for authorization, we have inherent auth from parent, which means that as long as this is saved to a collection and it has a parent, it'll use that authentication. Over here, click Save, and it's going to ask you what you want this to be. I'm going to call this Get Me as a name, and it's asking which collection to save it into. So let's save this into the Flow Connector to Microsoft Graph collection that we created. And I'm going to choose Save. Now I ought to be able to click Send and get back a payload. You'll notice it has Megan Bowen. I'm logged in as Megan, so that's the information I'm getting back. Our request, our authorization, all of that worked just fine. The next request that I want to make is going to be the group Delta query request. I'll click to create a new tab, I'll add my group delta query. I just pasted this from my blog post. You'll notice that I have two curly braces around group ID. This is a variable in Postman and makes my life a lot easier, because now what I can do is, let me save this, and it's going to offer to save it to the active collection. And I'm going to rename it because I don't like that. We'll rename it Group Delta Query. So I need to resolve this variable in Postman. So let's do that. I'm going to go down to my collection. I'm going to hit the ellipsis, and I'm going to choose Edit. I'm going to go to Variables, and here I'm going to add Group ID, and as an initial value, I'm going to use the group ID of my target group, which is spanning protected users. And then choose Update. Now that I've done that, I should be able to hover over group ID and see that it has picked up, Postman has picked up my group ID for my test. Let's go ahead and hit Send. And I get not only a result, but down here I'll see a whole bunch of users. Now, a lot of these users have been deleted because I've been doing this demo so many times that I've added and removed people. But there are still a few users here that have not been removed, and that's a good thing. I'm going to choose Save one more time. Now that I have the two requests that I need, I'm going to come back down to my collection. I'm going to choose the ellipsis and choose Export. Now, the V1 collection is the only kind of collection that the Flow connector can import. So we'll choose that as our export. And now that that's successfully exported, we can move on to the next step. Now that you've created the Postman collection, we can move on to the next step, which is to take that Postman collection export and create a Microsoft Flow custom connector from the Postman output. In Microsoft Flow, choose the gear button and choose Custom Connectors. We're going to choose Create Custom Connector and Import from Postman Collection. You're going to import your V1 file. And choose Continue. Now you want to add an icon so that you can recognize the connector when you see it in the list of available connectors. I'll make mine really easy to spot. I'm not so worried about a background color, but this does take a hex value, so if you have some transparency, I'll make mine white. Now it's picked up the description, the scheme, and the host from our import. So at this point, let's just choose Create Connector. Probably the most important part of creating a connector is the security. So we're going to choose Security. And then you'll remember we were using OAuth 2, so let's choose OAuth 2. And since we're authenticating against Azure Active Directory, let's choose Azure Active Directory. These values should start looking familiar to you because you've been doing this so many times. The client ID is going to come from our app. And that's right here, the application. Notice it even says client in there now. The application ID. The secret. leave the login the way that it is, leave tenant ID as common. The resource URL is going to be https://graph.microsoft.com, and then this redirect URL will be populated when we update the connector. Then we're going to take that redirect URL and put it back into our app so that the app sends flow back to where it belongs, just like we did with Postman. So I'm going to choose Update Connector. And right down here is my redirect URL. Let's copy that to the clipboard, go back to our app, and edit the redirect URIs. Choose Save. And then in our flow, make sure that we've updated the connector. I think I already did that, but you can never be too safe. Okay, now on to the definition tab. You'll notice that it has Get Me and Get Delta Query. Where did it get this information? Out of the file that we saved from Postman. So you're starting to see kind of why we like that Postman import, because it did a lot of work for us. It also created the requests. Now the thing it didn't do is it didn't trim this URL. And what I mean by that is it's using the entire URL, which isn't necessarily needed. We could have just pasted in here v1.0 me, and it would pick up the host URL from this general tab. Just so you know, that's an efficiency that you can use. So it has the request set up. The response, let's look at what happens when we execute this action, and we'll see if the response comes back the way we want. Finally, if I go into Group Delta Query, it's created the operation, it's got the verb, in this case it's a get, and it has the Group Delta Query, but look at this, it has filter and select and expand, which are all of the variables that we had in Postman for our request. We're going to modify that a little bit, but let's just see where we are right now. I'm going to choose Test, and you'll notice it says no connection. Well, let's fix that. I'm going to choose New Connection, and it's going to authenticate me. So I'll choose Megan's account, and you'll notice nothing happened. So let's choose Update Connector. Still nothing's happening. So click refresh, and if it doesn't work, click refresh again. Okay, since it's not working here and I want you to see the troubleshooting that happens, I'm going to choose Update Connector one last time, and then I'm going to click to go all the way out to all of my custom connectors. Sometimes when you come here and you choose Create Connection, it will try to authenticate you, and then you'll get an error. So in this case, it's telling me that I'm unauthorized. So there's something wrong with the credentials that I supplied in my connector. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that, and then we'll come back to this screen. It appears the problem was a bad client secret. So I just copied the wrong value in, but at least you get to see kind of how that stuff goes. I'm going to choose Edit here. We'll go back to Test, and now we're going to create a new connection. There it is. Now, if the connection doesn't show up, if this is still grayed out, do click this refresh button, because sometimes I've seen that work when the connection is made but doesn't refresh the screen quite correctly. Now, this is going to become a list of connections if you keep clicking New Connection. Now, why would you do that? Well, you might need to get a refreshed token or other You might want to have a connection to one system and a connection to another system. There's different reasons for needing additional connections, but they'll all be listed here. And the date should match your date closely, but the time will probably be offset because it's UTC time. And so mainly pay attention to the minutes and seconds so that you know which one is the correct one for you to get. Anyway, having done all that, we're authenticated. I'm going to choose test operation for get me, and it should give me back an OK200. If it doesn't, then you need to correct your definition for get me. Now, this result we can use to be able to get parameters back from our definition. So I'm going to copy this and go back to the get me definition. And in my response, I'm going to add a default response and just paste in and then choose import. Choose update connector and then go back to your test page. Test the get me operation, and it should work just as it did before, but I'll show you why we did that in just a second. The next is group delta query. I want to test this operation. I need a group identity, but you'll notice that it already has the display name and the members in there, which is nice because that came over from our Postman collection. The group ID, we'll paste in, and then we'll test the operation. I got back an OK200. I'm going to grab all of this as my body and copy that. Then we'll go back to our definition. We'll choose the group delta definition, and then down under the response, I'm going to choose add default response and paste in that response. Choose update connector, and then one last test. Make sure get me works, and it does. Make sure group delta query works. I need a group ID. Test the operation, and that works. So choose update connector one last time. And now we can test our connector. So let's create a simple flow using our new connector. I'm just going to trigger the flow off of a button push, but what I want to show you is that if I search for graph, it finds our graph flow connector, and it has the two options. Get me is one of them, and group delta query is the other. Now I'm going to stop right here because there's a few things I want to fix. For instance, the group ID, that variable, I don't really like it coming through this way. Also, I am not getting all of the parameters that I need to be able to actually execute a delta query, because there should be a skip token and a delta token. But since I didn't include them earlier, I'm not seeing them here. So let's fix all of that. I'm not going to save this flow. I'm just going to go back to connectors and down into custom connectors. I'll find my custom connector and let's edit this. If you've been following along from previous blog posts, you'll know that the group delta query request will take two additional parameters, and that's the skip token and delta token parameters, but they're not represented here. So let's fix this request. We're going to choose get, and I should mention all you actually need is this part of the request if you want. You can use the whole thing, it doesn't matter, but I want to show you that you have that option. I'm going to choose Control C there. I'm going to choose get, and then for the URL, I'm going to put in the shortened version of beta groups delta. Now, I'm going to also paste in onto the end of the URL the additional parameters. So I now have the filter, the display name that we had before. I have expand, but I've also added skip token and delta token. You don't need to include any values there because all that the parser is looking for is the presence of those variables, and choose import. Once you've done that, you'll see that it did use the host from the general tab and then applied beta groups delta. Also notice that I've got my delta token and my skip token available. For the response, I'm going to copy the response from my blog. You could do this from Postman if you wanted. It doesn't really matter where you get it from. The important part is that in the response, you have all of the available options. So here I have Delta Link, and down here I have Next Link. Both of those are important when we run our request. Choose Update Connector, and return to the test page. Choose your group delta query, and you'll notice that we now have all of our 5 parameters. I'm going to paste in my filter, remembering to put quotes around the group ID. Select gets display name, and expand gets members. Test the operation, and you should get back a 200 response with the available body. Now, I didn't use this body as my sample because you'll notice it only contains the next link. It doesn't contain a delta link, which I also need to make sure that the schema is available for my connector. So choose Update Connector one last time, and then let's return to Flow and create a new flow. So as we did before, go to My Flows, create a new flow from blank, create from blank, use a flow button, and then for the next step, choose your graph connector. I'm going to choose the group delta query here, and I have all 5 of my attributes ready to go. That's awesome. Let's go ahead and add another action above that, which is the get me. There's nothing that's requested with get me, it just returns values. So here's our group delta query. We need a filter. We need a select. You can supply these, I should point out, you can supply these as defaults if you want. In fact, I'll go back and do that. I'll show you how to do that. But we're testing. So expand is going to be members, and then we're going to leave skip token and delta token blank. The thing I also want to show you is that we now have, because we supplied the schema to get me and group delta query, notice that get me offers all of this information. That's kind of cool. If I throw a compose action at the bottom here, just to test it, and I look at the outputs of the group delta query, here's delta link, next link, body, description, display name. What's the display name? That's the group display name from the response. I think that's kind of cool. So that's what the advantage that you get from having the schema in your connector. Let's retitle this and save it. Oop. Input required, my compose action. And then let's test it. Boy, this is some great UI. Run the flow. Look at the output of get me. You'll notice it says Megan Bowen. Look at the output of group delta query, and there it is. So our connector is working beautifully. I do want to make one other change, so I'm going to come back here. I'm going to delete this flow because I don't need it anymore. Return to my connectors, and I'm going to make one last change just to show you that you can. I'm going to go into my custom connector and edit it. I'm going to go into my definition, and for the group delta query, the filter that we want a default value for this. So let's use something like ID equals group ID. Let's see if it'll take that. I'm kind of going off script here. We'll go back. For select, we'll go back. And for expand, we'll go back. So we'll update the connector, perform our test, choose group delta query, and there are our default values. So let's make sure we didn't break anything. And we didn't. So I'm going to choose Update Connector one last time. Go into Flow. Create a new blank flow. And there are our default values. So that's kind of cool. We've got the group delta query working, but let's put it into action. And that's what I'm going to do in the next step. We've created our flow with our custom connector and we've tested it. But the next thing I want to do is actually use this in a flow. And of course, you know, we're going to update the flow that we did previously to make the magic happen. In a previous series, I created a very complicated flow that is fully documented at the bottom of this final blog post in the series. This is the flow that we're going to walk through and fix with our new custom connector. I'm not going to build it from scratch. If you want to do that, you can follow along in the blog post series to build it up, because I do go through all of the steps to build up this flow. But I'm going to use this as our starting point and give you a sense of where we are. So in our flow, one of the things that we need to do is we need to capture a delta link value and store it. And so I do that in a list called flow groups configuration. And since I was building the video, I called it video, and there's an item called delta link. So this is the SharePoint item that I'll be referencing in the workflow. We're using the same group that we used before in Azure AD. And so I'm going to take the flow groups blog post and I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to call this way more secure blog post. Choose save. And what's interesting about the save as is it saves it, but since it's a duplicate, it saves it disabled. So we'll have to return here after we edit it and re-enable it. Actually, I can just enable it now. Now we're going to edit. So in this flow, we manually trigger the flow, and then we grab the tenant ID, the client ID, and the secret. Well, now you know we don't need any of that. We still want to initialize our users, our next link, and then get the delta link and evaluate that. So I'm going to come over here to tenant ID, and I can try to delete these guys if I want to. Choose OK. And client ID, this is where I got into trouble. with the secret value. So I'm coming up here. The secret ID, we don't need that anymore. I'm going to delete that. And now what I have is manually trigger the flow, create an array of users, create a variable called next link, try to get the delta link, store that value in the delta link, and then right here I'm doing an authorization step. Well, I don't need to do that anymore. So I'm going to take out this get token. But notice I can't delete it. And the reason I can't delete it is because it's being used. The output of this is being used in other places. So let's open this out, get rid of the body, and now I should be able to delete that. So now I'm triggering the flow. I'm coming down here. This JSON, we don't need anymore. We don't need that access token, but it's being referenced in other places. So let's start right down here where I'm doing my get members initial and get members group delta, and let's add our new, more secure, better than ever. I mean, it's better just because it has Ruby's face on it. And we're going to choose group delta query. I'm going to put another one over here so you can see that these actions are similar but not the same. And if you'll remember earlier, when we were coming down, we came down and we executed, after we got the access token, which we'll fix in just a sec, we execute a group members query. And this is all of the info for that group members query. Instead, we're just going to paste in our group ID. See how easy this makes it? There's nothing else that has to happen. That's done. But I am going to give this a better name. I'm going to call it get group member initial query, just like I did above. Oh, sometimes I hate the flow editor. Well, not sometimes, pretty much always. Once I have that done, the other advantage I have is I don't need to parse the body of that request anymore. So I'm going to come back up here. I should now be able to delete this get group members initial query. I don't have to parse the group members anymore, but I do have to remove the references. So I'm going to swap out this OData next link because I'm not parsing these users anymore. I'm going to add my get group OData next link. The delta link is the delta link, and the users array. The users array still has to be processed because you see that we have members delta and value. The value is a wrapper around the members delta. So I'm still going to need this members delta, but instead of taking it from the parse JSON, I'm going to take it from the group delta query. And I should be able to do that by coming in here and grabbing the body plus the value and then swapping it for this value. So now I have the body of the group delta query, the first item in the body of the group delta query, value, member delta. Now I want to draw attention to the question mark that I have here that says that if that's null, let's put another one. So this question mark is saying that if that's not null. And so we just want to make sure that we have a value in there. I'm going to copy all of this because I don't trust the editor to do this correctly, to do the update correctly. I'm going to click update, and I'll click up here, and then I always come back, and it looks like it looks like it did save it, so that's good. So we'll choose save here, and we'll probably get some errors. Yeah, we're getting some errors because we're still sort of in edit mode. I've fixed that. I've fixed this. I've fixed that. So this is where I'm getting my error. So let's delete that. And now we're starting to look pretty good. Get the group member's initial query, set the next link, set the delta link, set the users in array. I'm going to do the same thing over here. So please listen to some beautiful Keith Ritchie music. Okay, so I've cleaned up the entire flow. I intentionally left in one error that I want to point out to you. So I've removed all of the authentication and I've removed the secret from the start. So we initialize our users, we get the next link, we get the delta link if it's been stored in SharePoint. And then provided we are coming through and it's not a delta query, in other words, there's no next link or there's no delta link, then we're going to run an initial group members query and we're going to populate next link, delta link, and the users array. Once we come down in, we get the users in the array, and then we apply to each user in our users variable. We make sure that they haven't been removed, and we create the item in the group member table. So all of that is just as it was before, with the main exception that we're simply doing a group delta query here. So no more getting authentication and doing all of that. The connector's doing it for us. What if it's the second or subsequent requests? Well, if it's the second or subsequent requests, we're going to come down the no side, which means that we will have that delta link. So in our connector, we should be able to just supply the delta link. But here's the problem. If you think about the way that the request is crafted, the request is crafted to accept delta token without the delta token, which is what's being returned if you look at the result of the request. It's giving us back this entire URL, graph.microsoft.com, delta skip token, etc. So we're going to have to parse all of that stuff out, and I'm going to do that right now while you listen to some beautiful Keith Ritchie music. Okay, so what have we accomplished? Well, all of that futzing around was me parsing the delta link or the next link to simply remove all of the URL and just maintain the one token value that I can then put back onto the request, because the request is going to include all of that information. I initialize a variable called start index, and this is simply a variable that is the length of the value of the graph.microsoft.com. Sure, I could just count those I could just count those letters and put it in here. But if you're making a different kind of request, I thought you might want to have that as an example. Once I have the start index, I then get the token length. And the token length, if the delta link returns a value, then it's the length of the delta link. That's all it is. It's just an integer that is the length of the token. Then we go down into our queries. Now, the group delta query, if it's an initial query, doesn't need any of this. So we're only working our way through the set variable side. So I'm going to set the token length variable based on the length of the delta link minus the index of the variable delta link, so where it actually finds that delta link variable, and the token, and then the length of that word delta token, because I want to trim everything off the beginning. And so that's what this allows me to do. This is just a simple calculation that allows me to figure out where that equal sign ends and my delta token begins. Once I have that, I then do a substring, and the substring is on the variable delta link, in other words, the whole URL plus the delta link. Then I'm going to add the index of the variable delta link and that delta link token, and then the length of the token itself and the whole token. So again, it's a substring, but I had to figure out a way to get there, and I think that I did. Once I have that, I have the actual raw token that I can then pass back into my delta token. Okay, we did exactly the same thing down here at the bottom, except we did it on the skip token, because this is a next link. So this is the skip token, and we're simply making those same calculations on the skip token to make that happen, and then we do a compose of a substring, and we pass that substring into our next data query for the skip token. So I hope it's not too confusing. All I'm doing is parsing a substring. It's just that Flow makes me do it this way. One last save, and then we're ready for our test. So if you weren't watching the other videos or reading the other blog posts, let me bring you up to speed. In Azure AD, I have a group spanning protected users. Currently, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they all start with A. And then I have a Flow groups list that is this is my configuration list, where I have delta link blank, and the video where I have the groups video where I have no values. So when I run this, I should get 6 users here, and I should get a delta link value. So our initial flow ran successfully. We made it all the way down. There was no passed delta link. And we get into our delta query. And since this is the initial query, we're going to go down the yes side. And here's our initial query. We populate the users in the array. We drop into the users array. And for each user, we had 21 user results. Now, there's only 6 in the group, but 21 including the deleted items. Then if the user's not removed, this one was. Yep, there's a true. We went down the yes side and we added the group member to the list. Once the users are added to the list, then we run our additional query to see if there's more data. And it turns out, if I choose get next data, that I have a skip token and no users. So we're going to drop down here. We can look at the delta link. Here's our delta link. The delta token came out perfectly. We look at our variable for next users. It's null, which is going to drop us out of the loop, and we'll save the delta link to SharePoint, which means if we go look in flow groups, we should see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 users. And if we look at the flow groups configuration, we have our delta link. Let's try the other side of the workflow. And what I mean by the other side is that this time we're going to return a delta link. So I'll choose test, perform the trigger action, and run the flow. The flow ran successfully. Remember, we haven't added any users. So we came down the no side, users in the array is null, so nothing happens here. There are no users in the array. Our condition is to null out the users array and then finish with the delta link. So the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to choose edit and I'm going to choose test, but I'm going to pause right here. I'm going to go back over to Azure and let's add a couple of users. I'm going to add some B users here. And then we'll go back over and we will rerun the flow. Now this is another delta query, but this time we should get some users. Success again. We're going to come down the no side because it is a delta query. If I look at the users in the array, I have my users. Those are 2 users. If I come down to my apply to each, I have 2, which means I should have 2 successes. I do. If I go back into SharePoint, I have a delta token still. If I go to flow groups, I should now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 users. So that's awesome. The last thing I want to do is show you how to get the usernames, because I'm sure by now you're wondering about the users. This is very easy to do. Again, listen to some wonderful Keith Ritchie music while I do this. So what do we do? Well, I added a get user action from Azure, which will take the ID that is returned by our query. And then in the items apply to each user in array, I added the ID or the ID field. That'll get us a user. And then in our create item, I'm simply using the results of that get user to get the ID of the user, their display name, and their user principal name. I also cleared out the flow groups configuration so that this query can run again. And so now you'll see that I have my users, Alex, Wilbur, Betsy, etc., the UPN, their active, and their ID. So using that Azure AD connection allows me to get user information. So there you have it. Create a custom Microsoft Flow connector that allows you to connect to external data like the Microsoft Graph in a secure way. If you like these videos, if you've made it this far, please subscribe. Thanks. Have a great day.